Welcome everyone. If you're viewing this video, it means we got the computer working and the camera's still working. There's a chance it won't, so I'm just going to put that there. I might keep that, I might delete that. Today we are going to be discussing the history of piracy in Pennsylvania, mostly in the 1690s into about 1700. It's very important when discussing Pennsylvania to actually start with the history of it. I'm just going to do a brief rundown. I'm going to try my best to keep it brief. So for those of you from Pennsylvania who care about where we're talking about, we're mostly going to be talking about Wawa country as opposed to Sheets and Rutter's country. We are going to have some input from Royal Farms country. Those of you not from Pennsylvania, we have a lot of convenience stores that there's a almost religious following with them. Texas, you guys have your Buc-ee's. You guys are pretty united on that as far as I'm aware. But Pennsylvania, we have Rutter's, Sheets, Wawa. That was no particular order. I do not want hate messages. If you want to comment like what your favorite one is, go ahead. You won't be judged as less of a person because of it. It's okay. Moving on. So when talking about Pennsylvania, naturally I have to talk about Penn's father, Sir William Penn. Admiral Sir William Penn. Yes, he was Navy. Charles II was a little salty about, what happened with his father. And he promised not to take it out so much on Britain itself. That said, he didn't make the same promises to the Dutch. He fought 2 wars against the Dutch. The conclusion of the Second Anglo-Dutch War is where we're going to really start. The Treaty of Breda of 1667, even though the Dutch won, they still gave up a lot of land to the British, mostly in North America. They didn't really care. They wanted the tropics. They didn't really care too much about the land that was very similar climate to Europe. And it gets complicated. I'm going to skip through it a little bit. They gave it up, but then they didn't give it up, but then they did give it up. And the French got a lot of what was then called Acadia, but we think of it now as New France, parts of North America. There was even one of the maps I viewed actually has New France ending at the Susquehanna River. So those of you from the west shore of the Susquehanna River, according to at least one map, you were in France. This is important because Sweden and the Netherlands had been fighting over what would become Pennsylvania. So the Dutch were in Pennsylvania first, then the Swedish came. The Dutch didn't really settle it, they mainly explored it. Then the Swedish came along, they started settling it, parts of New Jersey and Delaware. Then the Dutch took it over. At various points the French were exploring. There's even an account of the Spanish exploring. So there's quite a bit of activity going on in Pennsylvania before it becomes Pennsylvania. Well, Penn was basically, William Penn, not William Penn Jr., not his father, was basically, he was the rebellious son. Today you might think of, oh, he joined a punk band. No, he became a Quaker. The Religious Society of Friends. They were considered to be nonconformists. A lot of them did not want to participate in government, no taxes, no war, freedom of religion. A lot of what they were preaching were things that today we'd look at as, well, that's nothing revolutionary. That's great, especially in this time period. Except at that point in time, England had just gotten over a series of civil wars. There were major wars on religion in England, technically, and throughout the continent. It was not a good time to be anything other than Anglican, or if you're from Scotland, Presbyterian. I might do a video on religion in this time period. It's a very interesting topic, but we're going to stick to Pennsylvania right now. So, at this point in time, William Penn's in prison. His father's on his deathbed, and he gets help from the Duke of York, later known as James II, who by this point has actually captured what will become Delaware, but at this moment is pretty much his possession that he's fighting with Maryland over. See, I told you we get into Royal Farms country. Charles II owed a lot of money to a lot of people. Now, we think of Charles II, we think of him bringing in art and music and all this. He also fought a series of wars that he lost. And he owed a lot of money to William Penn's father. William Penn's father's on his deathbed. It's like, I might as well forgive my son. Gets him out of prison. And he ends up dying. Charles II still owes the debt to the family. So he ends up paying with a land grant, which would become Pennsylvania. In 1682, Charles II grants land to William Penn. William Penn wanted to name it Sylvania, which is basically Latin for woods. Charles II's like, you know, your family was good to me. How about you call it Pennsylvania? Okay, cool, Pennsylvania. So, at this point in time, William Penn starts getting everybody together and heads over. The first person who was actually there was not William Penn. It was actually his cousin, William Markham. William Markham is going to become one of the main people in what we're about to discuss. So, long story short, they get there, they start setting up Philadelphia. There were already Swedes, Dutch, even Finns living in the area, as well as the indigenous population, the Lenape. Penn was supposedly he was very diplomatic with the Lenape. He learned the language. He participated in ceremonies. If there was a certain way of meeting, he would do the same style. The problem is, William Penn did not stick around. William Penn eventually returns to London. James II is now king, briefly. And everything in the Pennsylvania colony starts to go downhill. A lot of the deals that were made with the Lenape were not honored. They had a prohibition against, shouldn't say it was a full prohibition, but it was pretty close to it, against taverns. They didn't want any vice. By 1693, there were 20 taverns at least operating in Philadelphia. Some of them were basically speakeasies, and the rest were official. Slavery was another issue in Philadelphia. Even though we think of the Quakers as being very against, later on they did become very against slavery, at this point in time, they were not. Germantown, which was settled, of course, by German settlers outside of Philadelphia, they were constantly complaining, like, well, why do you guys have slaves? You shouldn't be this way. And slavery was definitely an issue. The Philadelphia that we're talking about in this time period is about 3,000 people. There's suburbs, but the core settlement of Philadelphia it's no longer the very green village that William Penn had set up. It's already becoming a thriving port full of people with many different ideas and many different lifestyles. There were various religious groups such as the Anabaptists, Amish and Mennonites, as well as some there was a few millenarian sects of different groups that would come over. There was at least one preacher from Transylvania that thought the world would end in 1694. This is the sort of world that we're entering into with this discussion. So, without further ado, let's actually get into the piracy. So, let us start with a person that, if you study this era, you're going to encounter quite a bit. Francis Nicholson, who at that point had already been Lieutenant Governor of New England. He was Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, and at this point he's the 7th Royal Governor of Maryland. He held that post from 1694 until 1698 when he became Governor of Virginia. At this point in time, James II has already been, there's been the Glorious Revolution. In has come William and Mary. William and Mary at first were briefly kicked Penn off of governorship. They weren't sure what to do with Delaware, and somehow Markham was still doing things. Markham, even though he was Penn's cousin, he was still, well, we don't have anybody else to run, and he's not being a problem. Let's let him alone. Well, he was Nicholson's problem. Nicholson did not like him. Nicholson did not care much for anything going on in Pennsylvania. Even though Maryland had been set up for religious freedom, Nicholson was not too keen on having more religious freedom right next door. A few decades before, Maryland had actually been attacked by Puritan radicals who briefly held Baltimore. So you can understand Nicholson's a little bit, a lot of your governors at the time, even ones who were very loyal to the crown, did not really want the crown interfering in their colonies. Well, his paranoia was very warranted. Now, at this point in time, we are in the 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the Grand Alliance. That would go from 1688 to 1697. It was basically everyone versus France. French privateers were operating on the East Coast. In 1698, which is right after the war ended, there was even Lewes, Delaware was actually attacked. It is in 1692 that Richard Want enters the scene. Now, actually, I should clarify, he actually appears earlier, but there's not solid information. He served on the Bachelor's Delight. If any of you watch Golden Gunpowder, you are aware of that ship. He was basically in the same crowd as Dampier, Swan, several others. Eventually, he signs up with Thomas Tew with the Amity. He was apparently the first mate. They have their successful mission. They return. Richard Want, by this point, already settled in Charlestown, but would periodically go out, in that case with Tew. He decided he was going to get married and just fully settle down. 1694 rolls around, and Tew wants to do another Red Sea mission. So Richard Want's like, we've all taken pardons and stuff. We don't really want to be too involved with piracy. I need to make myself legitimate. So he goes to Philadelphia, where Lieutenant Governor Markham was more than willing to give him a commission. Now, there's two different stories on where the ship came from. We do know the name was the Dolphin. There's one source that says it was a Spanish brig that was refitted in Philadelphia, a brigantine. Another says that it was built in Lewes, Delaware. Again, I need to clarify again, at that point, Delaware being Pennsylvania. In fact, if I say lose Delaware, just assume I'm talking about Pennsylvania until actually way out of the scope of what our group talks about. So, if I talk about lose Delaware, it's Pennsylvania. No offense to lose and Delaware. Might as well give a side note on that. When Delaware became the first state, they not only declared independence from England, they declared independence from Pennsylvania. So, little side note there. So eventually, Richard Want meets up with the Amity. There's the Portsmouth Adventure, there's the Dove. And there is the Fancy. You know, like the name of this channel. The Fancy was commanded by Henry Every. It had been previously known as the Charles II. I'm not going to get very deep into this because there's plenty of videos available online. There's plenty of reading, there's plenty of books. I mean, Henry Every was, when people talk about pirates, they always go, oh, Captain Kidd. No, Henry Every was the real deal. So, it's going to get dark, don't worry. It's going to turn into a very dark story very soon. So, the Dolphin was considered to be an ill sailor, and it was scrapped. Richard Want and the remainder of the crew, keep in mind, a lot of these sailors came from Pennsylvania. They came from that area, and now suddenly they're on the Fancy. That is the combined crew that ended up attacking the Ganges Sawah, also known as the Gunsway in English. Richard Want eventually makes it to the Bahamas, and he ends up going home to Charleston. By 1696, the last record of him has him getting another commission, this time from South Carolina. 1697, we have the proclamation for the apprehending of Henry Every, alias Bridgman. Robert Sneed, formerly of Jamaica, where it needs to be added, according to several family documents I've found online, there's actually descendants of Robert Sneed. He apparently was accused of participating in piracy of a Spanish ship. He managed to get out of it, but I think that whole incident might have played a part in why later on he's a little bit... He cares about his job. And we can't fault Robert Sneed for this. We cannot. So, Black Flags, Blue Waters by Eric J. Dolan. It's an excellent book if you want to read more on pirates in North America, but he has a very great... He goes very in-depth with everything that happens with Robert Sneed and the crew of the Fancy. So, by this point, the pirates had arrived in 1696. Robert Sneed is naturally a little wary about this. I mean, he's colonial magistrate. He has no power at this point because some of them could claim they had the commission with Richard Want. They could have been legal. There's no way for him to be 100% sure that they were not. He had suspicions, but he had no way to confirm them. By this point, of course, we still have our good friend Francis Nicholson of Royal Farms Country. He is presently getting more and more suspicious of Governor Markham. Markham, now we're going to skip just briefly. Markham at this point has made friends with Thomas Day. Thomas Day had sailed over from Bristol in 1696. His captain died, so he took command and sold the ship and cargo and bought a brigantine. He went north and got a commission from Governor Markham. Robert Quarry, who was at that moment an official for the Carolinas, he was like, oh, he's a great guy. Robert Quarry is one of those who appears throughout all the colonies, just different positions. Actually, at this point, I think he was actually in a position in Pennsylvania. Well, Nicholson was not happy because there's this guy, he's pretty sure he's going to run off to the Red Sea. And Markham's like, well, we have French privateers everywhere. We need this guy. He's going to help us. I'll quote him directly. Governor Nicholson alleges that I got great matters by Day's commission, but I solemnly declare that I had not the value of a farthing for it, and gave it only in view of the common danger. Essentially, they were accusing him of being bribed into giving this commission. Markham was, no, I did not. I would never do such a thing. Day ends up sailing toward Holland, where apparently he got a new ship, and either there or on the way back, he did take a French ship and took it to Charleston, South Carolina. No idea if any money ever made it back to Markham, but that's the last we really hear about him. But in this time, a certain James Brown, not that one, Edmund Lassell, Peter Clausen, and Robert Clinton arrived in Philadelphia. There were most likely several others. They had allegedly each paid Governor Markham £100. Now, that didn't seem like a lot of money, so I looked it up. So, allegedly, according to Sneed, they had £1,000 on each of them. So, those of you who are familiar with British pound, you're like, that's they're not going to do much of that. In today's money, amounts to roughly £230,000, or about $285,821 US dollars. I got specific on there because that 800 could go either way. The amount they paid him was approximately, in either amount, upwards of $25,000. So, in American dollars, it would have been over $25,000. In pounds, it would have been about $23,000. That's a lot of money. So he was given roughly $100,000 in modern money. A little less in British pounds. That was pretty decent hush money. James Brown attracted the attention of Anne Markham, Governor Markham's daughter. He ends up serving on the Colonial Council. There's a great online source called British History Online, which, if you search it, can bring you up a lot of documents relating to pretty much whatever you want. This is a collection of documents that came from the West Indies, so also North America. Among them is a letter from Robert Sneed to Sir John Houblon. Now, Houblin's name comes up with the fancy, as he was actually the original owner of the Charles II. He was in charge of the Spanish expedition shipping. Honestly, reading about him, he should have been charged for not paying his people. Yeah, it was a very messed up situation. His name also, Dampier also appears, but Dampier was like, you know, I'm already known as a buccaneer. I don't really want to get associated with this whole pirate thing. I'm sticking out of this. No, I'll make money off my book. Don't worry about paying me. I'm good. I am sorry for the occasion that makes me write to you. On the 10th of August, 1696, a proclamation came to my hands and another to Mr. Penn's deputy, William Markham, who took no notice of it. I thought it my duty as a subject and a magistrate to prosecute the purport, which was to apprehend Henry Every, alias Bridgman. Yes, it is this document right here that he is referring to, which, sorry, as a history nerd, being able to hold a copy of that document, it's great, it's great. Snead goes on to say that he went immediately to the governor and it's like, hey, we have this document, we know where these people are, one of them's married to your daughter. I mean, and the governor basically was like, you know, just stay out of this. Just leave it alone. Leave it alone. Everything's good. Well, Snead wasn't having any of that. Now, Snead gets into some interesting points here, which I have actually never encountered mentioned elsewhere. They ran away from Jamaica with a ship. Now, is it something he misheard? We're not sure. A princess who was given in marriage to a great man was on her way to him by sea when they took the ship. They killed most of the men and threw her overboard. They brag of it publicly over their cups. When the governor heard that I was going to apprehend them, he sent for me, threatened to send me to jail, and dared me to do it, telling me I should not frighten people with my warrant. Now this is interesting. He's mentioning Day in this one. He has lately given commissions to other such rogues. One Day came with a large ship full of sugar and indigo to Carolina, sold the cargo, laid the ship up, bought a vessel for piratical purposes, and came here. The governor gave him a commission. And they are gone on their errand as they themselves own. Now, Snead gets into detail, but I'm going to paraphrase basically what happened in Philadelphia. So, immediately, Snead's trying to make these arrests, and Markham's wife and daughter apparently ratted him out to the pirates. So, Robert Clinton, Edmund Lassell, and Peter Clausen started harassing Snead. He went to his other judges, Edward Shippen. Those of you from Pennsylvania should recognize Shippen. Anthony Maurice, who had a relative who was married to Clausen. They arrested them, and then the justices allowed them out on bail. Snead was not having any of it. He arrested them again. This time he had James Brown as a witness. They got bailed out again. Snead decided at this point to issue his own warrants. That's the moment where he started getting into that little bit of a verbal battle with Markham. Snead was actually stripped of his weapons, but he managed to get the pirates arrested again. Clinton and Lassell escaped through a hole in the wall, allegedly. A witness to the jail, a sailor who had apparently known Clinton, described him as being too corpulent to fit through the hole in the wall. It was most likely the sheriffs actually let them out. Clausen was later released. Where they went to, we are not entirely sure. James Brown, there's two different records I've encountered on James Brown. One has him going to New York and actually sitting on their legislature after Pennsylvania's legislature. He apparently served out his time. The other one that I recently encountered has him actually being arrested in New York and sent over at the same time as Kidd was being sent over, for possibly the same ship. And the next document has Anne Markham, well, at that point, Anne Brown, listed as a widow. It's the thing about history, and names that are very common, it's tough to know. By this point, King William is, of course, very frustrated. All the governors that are actually doing their jobs are frustrated. Nicholson's frustrated. Everybody's frustrated. Penn finally has to come back to Pennsylvania. And for some reason, everybody in Pennsylvania history misses why he came back. Penn arrives and immediately removes Markham, and also discovers that a lot of the bookkeeping was a little shady. He complains about there being fraud committed, but as far as I'm aware, nothing ever happened to Markham. In 1703, Penn actually made him Register of Wills. In case some of you don't know what Register of Wills is, there's a very good chance that if anything implicated him, documents like hereditary documents, could be why some of the information's a little sparse. Not saying he did anything, but knowing Markham, I wouldn't put it past him. So the War of the Grand Alliance ends in 1697. In 1698, and we're going to include the video on this, a ship sailing out of roughly the Chincoteague area of Maryland on its way to Philadelphia was attacked by a French, most likely privateer, who maybe didn't get the memo the war was over. The only name we have for him is Canute, which those of you who are familiar with Viking history probably was not his actual name. We don't know his name. He ends up taking the ship. A few months later, he raids Lewes. He actually took the cattle, took the food. Apparently, anything that was not nailed down, he took. And ran off with it. Could he be one of the later French pirates that were captured? We're not sure. All we have is Canute and that he attacked Lewes. That concludes this video. I may do another one on later Golden Age piracy. There's a lot of Pennsylvania folklore related to pirates, as many states. There are several accounts of thieves who ended up robbing a train or a bank and taking money and getting onto a boat and hiding it somewhere. They're not pirates. The closest we have to actual piracy occurring in Pennsylvania would have been the start of Chris App's War, when people in a boat from Lancaster attacked a boat that was at that time sailing on the York side, which would have been part of Maryland. And there was a brief firefight, and they apparently took one of the workers who was actually wanted for crimes in Lancaster. Technically, it was an act of piracy. Later on, you do have privateers and such during the American Revolution. There's quite a bit more history, but for now, we're going to conclude it around 1699. Next video, I'll probably go over the Golden Age piracy as it relates to Pennsylvania itself. There is actually a lot of relevant information that is definitely worth looking into. Those of you with access to various archives that might not be online, do your best to get those online. If you, I recently saw a Historical Society posting something about having a pirate skull. I'm curious about that. Do I disbelieve it? Yeah, strongly. But if there's documentation associated with it, I'd love to know. There's definitely a lot of the history in this area. You might catch a letter, oh, that thing that happened last year. Well, what's that thing that happened last year? There's no documents for it. Or you might find a record in England that pertains to right here. But you don't have any supporting documents in Pennsylvania itself. So, If this video needs updated, which I hope it will eventually, I will make a new version of this, probably keep this one. So, if you find anything, let me know. If you liked it, like, share, please subscribe. We want to keep this channel growing. We actually wouldn't mind the ad revenue, so we can actually start doing more things. So, take care, everyone. Have a good day.